Welcome. I'm Chris McKean.
And I'm Andy Kiner.
We're all about cross-country racing, and normally it starts with 10 seconds.
But not in Iowa. In Iowa, it starts with hands-on helmets.
Hey, welcome. Another week. Feels like it was just last night we were talking.
It does, don't it?
Oh, I had a week off. Well, actually, I had 2 weeks off. You've had 1 week off. Seems like some illness is going around. I've got a cold again. I'm hoping that's all it's out to be. Doesn't turn into anything else, but we'll work with it.
And both of our guests are back healthy, so that's good.
Yeah. Funny thing is, I've got several people have reached out to me in the last week or so about tires for a Prius. What's going on there?
For a Prius. Huh. I guess I don't recall what was
Gotcha. I'll get you back. Get you back, buddy.
They must have seen you out driving.
I have a Bronco and an F-150. No Prius in my sight.
Listen to you try to be all manly now when people found out you drive a Prius. I got an F-150. Shoot. That's too funny.
Yeah. So, yeah, as always, we always continue. We have lots of things going on behind the scenes, but, man, we had a couple meetings last night. We met with our UTV committee and our ATV committee about some upcoming changes. So it was quite the night last night.
I'm excited about having all them guys on that committee, and I think just makes things run just a little bit smoother,
Yep.
So
we'll get them all introduced here shortly, most likely at the banquet. The representatives for both adults and kids. So
throw a little teaser out there. We got more big news today too. I got to clarify a couple things, but have another big announcement for the banquet is when it'll come out. So,
oh man, banquet's adding more and more to the banquet. Yep. We're gonna have to start at noon.
Are you going to have any room to take anything down? Are you driving the Prius or the F-150?
Oh, I don't know. For you, yeah.
I think if you drive the Prius, well, I'll get a spot right up front for you. I'll have a sign made that says Chris McKean Prius parking only.
Thanks, buddy.
I think they would allow us to do that.
I could probably, borrow my mother-in-law's Prius if it's needed. Let you take it out for a test drive, but no, I got quite the. Well, I actually have jackets. Should have wore one tonight. Championship jackets in the other room that are all ready to go. So we'll be bringing those down with us.
That's the thing. I don't think a lot of people. I know we've talked about before with you being able to do jerseys and that kind of stuff, but I don't think people really realize. Behind the scenes, how busy you are with all that kind of stuff, with the different t-shirts you've developed. And of course you've been slagging lately. Usually we get to see one, and I haven't seen one for a while, but you've been helping us. Now you're doing all the jackets and stuff. And we really appreciate that. That's pretty cool. So
yeah, no new shirts. I've, started a new job in, what was that? November. I'm working quite a bit. So trying to sneak in this and the other behind the scenes things that we're working on. Hopefully to have it ready by the banquet as well. We'll get some new t-shirt designs. I got something brewing in my head. Yeah, it'll come out shortly.
Cool. So
All
what
right,
do we got tonight?
Well, you tell me. So
You
we
know,
talked.
you're
That's kind of like we've talked about. Making or buying the right 4-wheeler, or getting the right 4-wheeler to make sure it fits. Well, we talked about protection. Talked about tires. What's next?
Leading up to this, it's always funny because I know I've talked to both of the guys are going to be on here tonight about this, but when guys jump on the series and they start racing, and there seems like everybody's kind of shy at first. They don't know anybody when they first get in there. You line up, and you know how it is, Chris. When you line up on any of our lines, everybody around there is going to be talking to you, helping you answer any question, and stuff. But
Yep.
Seems like about 3 to 4 races into it, all the new guys are always talking like, "Oh, I'm gonna put a cam, or I'm gonna do this to my motor," and they want to build that motor up big. And every time, 100%, I can tell you, every time somebody has came up to me and said that,
Mhm.
I would take their hand. I said, "Remember, there's no trophy for the most wheel spin. If you're gonna if you're gonna want to go faster, you got to be able to, ride the machine at its full potential." And I said, "That's keeping the tires on the ground, And I said,
Mhm.
start focusing on the suspension." And so the
Yep.
suspension is the biggest thing, I think, of anything when we start. Before we've been
Yep.
talking about safety stuff, on the protection and and then tires, is a natural thing to look at. But now it's actually, we're talking about probably the number one thing to get faster is your suspension.
Yep.
So that's what tonight's all about. And we got a couple of the experts to talk about.
We don't race on a flat track. We race on all kinds of terrain. So the more that you can keep that quad at a level pace, and that suspension can soak up those bumps and rocks and stuff, it'll help you go faster.
Exactly.
All right. So we have, excuse me, we have 2 guests. We have Matt Lindle making a return.
Sweet.
And also Bart Thompson. So let me go ahead and bring him on. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thanks for having us.
Morning, Bart. Morning, Matt.
Yeah.
This is morning somewhere.
Hey, I want you both to understand that had I been in charge of like the technical side of things and bringing you guys on, I would have had like a drum roll or something ready for you two coming on board.
I don't know if I believe that.
I would have. I'm telling you.
I also heard somebody say experts, and I'm pretty sure only one of the 4 of us is actually an expert on this subject.
Well,
and I
thank
know
you
it's
for
not
giving
me.
Well, thanks for giving me that compliment.
So I think the biggest question here, guys, is can you do anything? Either one of you have any tricks? Do you have any suggestions for suspension on a Prius?
Don't purchase
never had one or been around one, so can't say I have any suggestions for Chris.
Chris obviously drives a Prius and an F-150, but he's wanting to start getting off-road, kind of going through his backyard and stuff. So he's kind of questioning the suspension updates now on one. So what would we do without Chris?
Yeah.
So I was just kind of talking leading into this, guys, and we were talking about, I know both of you have heard me say this before about guys coming in and, they get about 4 or 5 races into it and they're like, man, I'm going to go, do this to my motor. I'm going to bore this. I'm going to get faster. And I've always told them that, hey, we don't give a trophy for the most wheel spin. If you want to go faster, you got to get the full potential out of that bike. And it starts with suspension, in my opinion, just my opinion. And I'm not one of the 2 experts on here. So we can't wait to hear from you guys, but you guys both know kind of what this little series is that we're doing. Matt's been on here several times already, and Bart, you're the go-to. I consider you one of the, if not the best suspension guy I've ever dealt with, especially locally. And I think, unfortunately, the people long distance just didn't get a chance probably to deal with you, or they would have thought the same thing. So, but talking with Matt, and you were the kind of the perfect one to come on to kind of talk about the suspension. And Matt's been a test dummy for how many years now, Matt? So you got the proven, riding over the top of it and everything. So I'm just going to kind of turn the ball over to you guys. I'm going to try to keep Chris from talking so much and just let you guys kind of know, what the goal here is, to talk about the new riders, not even just new riders, but even could be a B rider, could be a C, could be a youth. I guess some of my questions would be maybe like, when do you start looking at suspension? When you're on a youth quad, obviously a 50 limited is probably not going to have much suspension, but kind of when you guys think maybe to start looking at suspension, and then, just kind of work from there, and tell us. A lot of people I see, kind of blame the suspension. Like, I blew this shock out, it seems like every race report, they blew a shock or they did something. And I just have a hard time believing that's the case if it's done right, from the get-go. So you guys got a ton of experience. I'm just going to let you guys kind of go with this. And, if Chris starts to butt in, I'll stop him. So.
Well, I would start off by agreeing with you, Andy, and I'm sure Bart would too. I personally think that there's nothing more important than the suspension at any age, at any level. If you're trying to conserve your body and you're trying to go faster, I mean, it's key. I mean, I've said it on another podcast. I've raced many races with nothing but suspension. I mean, stock motors and everything. I mean, it's key to me. It is the most important thing that you can do to your ATV, hands down. So start with that. I 100% agree with you on that. And even just revalves, it doesn't have to be the fanciest, most expensive stuff out there. I really think that I don't think I know. I mean, I won a lot of races on revalve shocks that Bart had done for me. I mean, it wasn't a secret. It's pretty easy to tell when they're still stock shocks.
What do you think, Bart?
Yeah, absolutely. Suspension is where I would start. I've had many people, like you said, that wanted to build engines and big horsepower, and I would tell them, I would say, hey, I said, put a camshaft and a pipe on it. If you can run that through the woods wide open, let's build you a big bore. But you got to make it handle first. It has to handle. If you don't have confidence in your four-wheeler that it's going to enter and exit a corner clean without two-wheeling or bicycling, anything of that nature, or swapping out from too slow a rebound or packing, stuff of that nature, then you have no confidence. You can't go fast. When you're comfortable on the quad and you know what it's going to do entering and exiting, and when you hit the harsh bumps and the whoops and stuff of that nature, and you don't worry about losing control of it because you're confident in it. Some of the biggest things that I tried to get across to people when I was building suspension is don't be afraid to adjust it. And why I say that, you wouldn't believe how many people would send their suspension in after a season to have it serviced. And I say, what do you need? Do you need more rebound? Do you need more compression? And they're like, I don't know. They're right where you put them last year. And just don't be afraid to adjust, because worst case scenario, if it's not right or if it doesn't feel good, just go back where it was and go the other direction. You can always correct it, put it back where it was originally, but unless you feel that difference in the way that handles it, there's so much adjustability to shocks today, and you can make it so much better. You don't have to fight it. If you have a good set of suspension on, utilize it, use it, adjust it. Matt could probably tell you for sure too that, if you're going to have a dry track that day, you make certain adjustments for dry or whether it's loamy or, whatever, wet, muddy, there's different adjustments for that. And keep in mind too, your suspension gets hot through a 2-hour race. So the fluids start to fade. So you need to prepare for that. Whether you want to start the ride off harsh and have it work its way into where it feels good toward the end, or if you want to set it up to be fast right off, but then you have to back it down later because your suspension's fading, then it starts beating you up pretty bad. So another thing that I used to try to get across to my riders was I've got to have input, or even your mechanic in the pit or your dad, you've got to communicate. even if you don't know what to do, somebody probably does, and if you're really fighting it, all you have to do is ask. Most people would be really glad to help you out. I know Matt, at the drop of a hat, would help anybody out if they had a question on suspension, which way to go, which adjustment to make. But to me, that is definitely the most important thing. If you have confidence in your four-wheeler, sky's the limit on how fast you can be. But without it, you're just fighting the whole race.
Yeah, 100% agree. That spot on. And I think another thing that you mentioned, Andy, was about how a lot of race reports have suspension problems in them or blaming suspension. The other thing guys have to remember is what Bart just said, that oil gets extremely hot. And now maybe at a C-class level, you're not going to notice that fading that Bart's talking about because you might not be pushing it quite hard enough. But your faster riders, it's noticeable, especially on loamy soils, because those are extremely hard on suspension components. The sand, the real loose soils, those really put a beating on it. So to me, you have to service your shocks, just like you wouldn't go the whole season without changing your oil. So why would you go your engine oil? So why would you go the whole season without changing your shock oil, without sending to somebody like Bart and having new seals, new nitrogen, new oil in it, even if you're not needing to make adjustments? I'm sure Bart's seen some absolutely terrifying stuff come out of shocks before that have been neglected. And that's probably a big part of that. I mean, people overlook it because it's easy to overlook, but really it's extremely important. I used to tell guys that a lot. I'm like, just, if nothing else, just send them in and get them serviced. Even if you're not making adjustments, you'd be amazed at how much better they're going to work with fresh fluids in them.
That makes sense. Exactly right. That's something I know we neglected and having them gone through. That's for sure. So we thought
you guys come in before that you just had to throw them in the trash. There was nothing left. Shafts were galled and blue. The bushings or the bushing or the sleeve inside the seal heads were gone. They wore into the aluminum or the steel. I mean, they were just destroyed. And at that point,
I know
it's more cost.
Yeah, I know it's something at the very, very beginning of my career I way overlooked and didn't think a lot of it because I just didn't know. And then, Bart really opened my eyes to almost everything I know about suspension and helping me with it. And like you said, with the input, Bart can attest to it. I was always picking his brain or wanting to try something or do something, and he was always there to help me and try whatever the hell I wanted to throw at him. It didn't matter how crazy it sounded or ridiculous, but we tried stuff constantly. It was just trial and error nonstop, and it really taught me everything I know. Just was literally self-test and picking Bart's brain. That's where I got 100% of it, really. 99% of it anyway.
Bart, when you were racing now, obviously I know you were on good suspension, but did you do much to your motors at all?
I generally had a camshaft, pipe, jetting, of course, and maybe a little bit of port work just to try to get some more low end, get that torquey feel to where you didn't have to scream the machine so bad. You could just use the suspension and just use the pull of the engine, but no, nothing crazy at all. Nope, I run stock pistons and, just maybe a little bit of port work just to knock the imperfections out of the heads, but that was about it.
I know in today's world, it's so easy to, and I'm not knocking anybody, so I'm not going to say names, but you take a car to go get worked on or a four-wheeler to go get worked on or something, and lots of times there's stuff that comes up that's going to make the mechanic money, that's suggested, it seems like, you know what I mean? And earlier you just mentioned that people come in and ask for motor work, and you would send them off to say, no, let's do the suspension first, before you did the motor work. I'm just curious, for you as a mechanic, do you make as much money suggesting them to revalve and stuff as you do if you were to go through their whole motor?
So do I make as much with the suspension as I do with the engine work?
I shouldn't say you make as much, but are they going to spend as much on the motor work or the suspension, maybe getting them revalved and stuff?
Well, the initial purchase of the suspension, of course, is generally, fairly expensive depending on how you want to go. Revalves is usually the cheapest way to go. Back in the day when I was doing them, you could do a full set ready to bolt on for about $700. That springs, valving, fluid, everything ready to roll. where, a podium was $1,200 and a set of floats was $1,600, which I know now it's probably well above that, especially if it's custom axis. Even Elka is really starting to get up there. But on an engine, oh my gosh, I've spent tons of money on engines. I fielded several pros for a while and, tried to help them out. And, when I did Michael Burrows and Josh Eaton for that 2 years, I completely rebuilt those engines 3 times a year for them. And that's new cranks and all. I mean, I was spending thousands of dollars, but, for them as a pro, that I could see where that would be necessary. But for anybody that's just learning, especially, first couple, 4 or 5 years, suspension's really the best way to go. Because once you've purchased it, whether it's used or new, it's just service and maybe some spring changes and just maintenance on them, pieces that wear, springs break, stuff of that nature, or you get faster and we need to stiffen the suspension with higher spring rates, different crossover rates. Like I said, there's so many adjustments to suspension, with crossover rates, especially. I love playing with that because you could bring the spring in sooner or later. You could cross it quicker. You could get into the main quicker. There's just so many adjustments you can make. But yeah, definitely suspension would be the cheapest way to go, just maintaining wise. The initial investment's usually a little tough on you, but once that's done, it's easy to keep them maintained after that.
Yeah, and I just wanted to, I knew you mentioned that earlier. That's why I wanted to say something is, again, we're talking about trying to guide people, kind of a cheat sheet here, but one of the biggest things for me is saving people money, is not spending money when you don't need to, so coming from like a Matt, a racer, myself, anybody like that's one thing. But when you hear it from a guy that's building suspension and you build motors and stuff like that, it just, to me, that speaks volume. You know what I mean? When you mention that, so I just wanted your opinion on that. Cause it just seems like, doing a motor seems like the way to go right off for so many people, and it can get pretty darn pricey, and it's probably not the right way to go. I mean, everybody's got their own opinion, but, just like we're just talking here with the suspension, like you said, initial investment. But after that, I mean, that same suspension you can run for, geez, how many years, if you're doing the maintenance of it, so.
Yep, exactly right.
Yep.
If you gave me an option to race the best motor ever built on any 4-wheeler, I don't care what make it is, who built it, the best motor ever built. If you could definitively say this is the best motor ever built, but I'm going to give you stock suspension, or you give me stock revalve shocks on a stock engine, I'm going to take that stock engine and revalve shocks 100% of the time. 100% of the time. There wouldn't even be a question. It wouldn't even be close. That's to me, every racer on the line, no matter what class you're in, should have stock revalves until you get to the pro class and you're trying to push the pace. That's adequate. And that's my opinion, of course. I'm not saying that's gospel. I'm just saying that's my opinion on it. You can do a lot with just revalves, and yeah, leave the motor alone. They're reliable stock. They get, like Bart said, they get expensive when you start messing with them too much. And to me, the revalves are fairly inexpensive and they work pretty dang good overall. I mean, yeah, they're not going to work as well as a set of floats or a set of stage 5 Elkas or Axis or something, but they're pretty dang good. And especially for most racers. I mean, I loved my revalves. My biggest complaint with the revalves was they do heat up faster. So at the pace I was trying to push them at, they did heat up, and I would start bottoming out pretty hard after about an hour. But other than that, I mean, they work really well. They really do. And it's fairly inexpensive.
So I'm glad you guys both kind of mentioned revalves, because typically when we hear people saying, I'm going to get new suspension, I mentioned, I think to you in past episodes, Matt, but it used to be that, whoever had the biggest ad, I think it was Works, I bought one time, and it wasn't because anybody told me anything. It's because Dirt Wheels did a hell of a job of advertising for them, and you open up Dirt Wheels, you see this big Works sign and, and the blue shocks, and oh man, those gotta be fast, but I bought a set, I put them on the machine that I was racing, and in my mind, I kept trying to tell myself it's better. Honestly, I don't know that it was better because it was probably never adjusted to me, And I never bought
Exactly.
any suspension, you know, so what I'm getting at here is so many people, you know, and there's a lot of great companies, you know, we ran Axis. You hear people talking about Elkas, you know, there's many other brands out there, I'm sure. But when people talk about, okay, I feel like I'm picking up my speed enough. I've listened to people tell me, I know that I should get suspension. And I hear them say, I'm going to get new suspension for the next race. What you guys are talking is not necessarily going out and buy some factory, you know, some hi-fi suspension that, you know, should be a lot better, which I'm not saying it's not, but you guys are talking about revalves. So for that new racer out there, it's starting. I talk to a guy all the time on a 400EX, and that's what he's talking about doing is possible revalves. Tell us, to somebody that really don't know what a revalve means, what is that doing for that machine? Whether you're on a 400EX, a 450 Honda, Yamaha, you know, or whatever, tell us what you're doing when you actually talk about revalve.
I'm going to let Bart take this one.
Revalving, generally what takes place is we open the shock up like we would anything else. The stock shafts are peened where they're not supposed to be manipulated or changed. So I generally will take them straight to the lathe. I cut the end of the shaft down enough where the nut could come off. Then I pull the valving out. I pull the piston off, everything. And then I restack that valving. I count it out where it is, and I write it down on a sheet so I know which combination is where the crossovers are. And then I've got several sheets, or at the time when I was doing it, I had several different builds that I could go by depending on the rider's capability, their weight, of course. And then I would just restack the valving shims inside of the shock to match what I'm trying to make for that rider, that specific setup. Generally, it was in a middle where if I got them back for a service, I could go either direction without a massive change. I wouldn't want to set something up really light and then the next time set it up really stiff where you're at one end of the adjustment and then at the other end. So that's where the input really comes into play. But basically, it's just a revalving of the shims in the shock. And then, of course, spring rate. We change springs for the linkage that is used, depending on the leverage ratio of that linkage. GT Thunder, we always had to run a real heavy spring rate on the rear of those. They were set up to be more plush, where like Dirtworks, their linkages, they were set up to not take as much spring rate, but they weren't as plush. You had a little more feedback. You could feel the quad respond better under you. You could tell, you know, if it was the rebound was too slow and it packed the rear end, or if it was too fast and start hopping really bad side to side on you, something of that nature. But where the trick really came in is in the fronts, running a dual rate or sometimes even triple rate. There's a couple companies that did triple. The guy who taught me most of what I learned was Andy Mall at Malltech ATV. Sadly, he's passed now, but that guy said it. His joke was if Elka could put 5 springs on a shock, they would, because it makes more money. So really, a dual rate is really. What's that?
I agree with that.
Yeah.
I found out later in my career, more springs doesn't necessarily make it better. Also, air doesn't necessarily make it better either.
So Andy always pounded into our heads, dual rate is really all you need. And in some applications, triple rate would work maybe better. But the dual rate setup, I did that to almost every revalve front I did is always dual rate minimum, sometimes triple. And what's really hard for people to wrap around their heads, and I did a couple of suspension classes. I think I did one for you up there, Andy. Yep. And I tried to explain what was happening, where people could actually visualize in their mind what's taking place. So that helped for them to give the feedback to the builder in order to make those adjustments for you. So dual rate front, single rate rear, linkage, and revalving. Usually we use a different weight oil than what comes out in the factory, and a good linkage. And that's a great start for anybody. and it'll be a world of difference. If you've been riding stock and you jump on a good set of revalves, you'll wonder why you hadn't done it sooner.
And I'm guessing from talking about the price and stuff, you're talking like 25% of the price, aren't you, compared to buying new?
I was doing a full set of revalves for about $700, and the link would run you about $150 to $200, depending on whose link it was. So for under $1,000, you had a full set ready to go.
Nice. Now, just curious, in your opinion, you've done everything with bikes, top to bottom. Is this not probably one of the biggest differences, whether it be a new rider or experienced rider, would tell? I mean, like going from a stock shock to a revalve for your machine, is that probably one of the biggest difference? You always hear people say, oh, I put a pipe on. Mine's faster now. Well, I think it's louder. That's why you think it's faster. You know what I mean? But you hear all these adjustments, and I put new tires on and stuff. But what I'm hearing with you guys, I'm guessing that to go from a stock, let's just say a 400EX, and I jump on a stock 400EX, and then I get a Bart revalve stuck on there. You know, it sounds to me like I'm probably really going to notice that difference and gain the confidence that you're talking, Bart, compared to some of these other, changes that I might make throughout the, learning my machine.
Absolutely. Yeah. You won't believe the difference it'll make. It'll be night and day, especially once you get the right height set up, you get the proper spring rates. Entering and exiting a corner is just, it's effortless at that point. You just aim it. You set the rear end up, you power out of the apex, and it just pulls. It just flat goes. You don't worry about the bicycling coming up on two wheels and having to shut down and hammer the brakes so you don't go over the corner and run into a tree. That confidence and that smoothness will make you faster for sure.
I know Chris has some questions that's being brought in, but really quick on that, before we get to that part, explain to us really quick. You mentioned cornering. So a guy that's just starting, okay, I'm going to guess he has no idea how that suspension upgrade is going to help him, corner. Will you tell us how that's going to work? Or either one of you, Matt or Bart?
Go ahead, Matt.
For me personally, I was just reading that question that popped up about caster. Sorry. Caster's an interesting one. That's a fun one to play with. For cornering, for me, I had a lot of problems with feeling like the bike was trying to jump out of the ruts, like come up. It was fighting me too much. It was trying to basically fight its way out of the ruts and out of the corner. I fought that a lot early on. And as we went, Bart and I played with the crossover he mentioned earlier. That was probably one of the biggest changes that I made that I really, this was later on when I was riding very good suspension and trying to make those fine tweaks. The rebound and the crossover for me in cornering made the biggest difference by far. I mean, it wasn't even close in the crossover, especially. But with that being said, if you go too far with that crossover, and I'm sure Bart can attest this, it can make other like braking bumps and some other things feel very harsh. So you have to kind of play the balance. But for me, those were two things that when I really started trying to tune my suspension in, the rebound and the crossover was what was made the big difference for me for cornering, especially.
So can you guys kind of dumbify this a little bit? Tell me, so because I hear this stuff from other racers and change your rebound, and this is the first time, I'll be honest, that I've ever heard someone talking about the crossover. So can you kind of take a second and explain what the rebound is? Obviously we you know what the word means, but tell us how that works and about this crossover. You guys are talking about that a lot.
I'll let Bart take those, or I can do one, I guess. But
yeah, well,
Bart's
rebound
more the expert.
Is how quick or how slow the shock re-extends after being compressed. So ideally you want that rear axle to follow, like say you're in a choppy section, you want your tires to stay in contact with the ground. You don't really want them bouncing off the tips so much, unless of the braking bump or whatever, unless you are on a motocross track or something, you're actually trying to go across the top of those whoops. But generally in the woods, we don't, deal with that type of a whoop. But you do get the up and down more or less in some areas. So you want the tire to stay in contact with the ground constantly. So if rebound is too slow, the suspension compresses and then re-extends, but it doesn't come back out as far as it compressed. So the next bump recompresses again, and then it comes out just a little more yet. Well, eventually you get what they call packing. Yeah, it just slowly packs that rear end to where it doesn't extend. And then you talk about harsh, that'll just beat your teeth plumb out of your head. But at the same token, if you get it too fast, then the shock has a tendency to extend so fast that it usually will end up throwing you almost over the bars or out of control, to where, you just, you got to be very cautious at that point. You're going to go over if you don't watch out. My son's a prime example of that. We tried a brand new shock and a new link one time, 0 ride time. We set it up where we would have everything else. He went over the handlebars and broke his wrist. A year later, had to have it fused and have pins put in it because it broke it so bad. Just because of the extension of the suspension, it threw him over the handlebars. And of course, so that's where rebound comes into play, is basically it helps really keep that rear axle and your rear tires in contact with the dirt constantly. So ideally, if you could go through those chop sections and it just feels like it's pulling constantly, then you're there. You're where you want to be. If the ass end's swapping side to side, or if it's packing and it's just beating your teeth out of your head, you've got to make an adjustment, or you're gonna be out of control.
Gotcha.
Yeah. It's typically, like Bart was saying, we in cross country racing we run a little bit slower than most on the rebound side, especially on the rear. And if you're real good and you've been doing it a while, you can kind of feel just by pushing on the. You'll see a lot of guys grab the rear grab bar and push on it. You can at least get yourself in the ballpark just by doing that. I know when I did riding schools, I had helped some people out and was made a few adjustments just by doing simple things like that. But that was a lot of years around and doing it and feeling just to get them in a bit, maybe a little closer ballpark and whatnot. And then your other question was the crossover. So that's so say if we're talking a dual rate front spring setup, there is, of course, your top spring is your smaller, lighter spring rate. So it takes less pressure to compress that one. And then your lower spring is your bigger, higher spring rate. The crossover is the transition point from when you're using the tender spring to where all the pressure goes to the main spring. And depending on the shock, some of them have collars that you can rotate to make that transition sooner or later in the shock travel. And then like the Elkas I ran didn't have that. So Bart would make me shims that I could put in there, or that he would put in there, that would make that transition sooner or later, depending on what I wanted out of that shock or wanted to try out of that shock. And I specifically remember one time Bart gave me his Elkas off of his machine to run, and I loved them, but I had a little bit of a complaint, and he said, let's try some crossover. And we put in, couldn't have been but a less than an 1/8 inch shim in there. And it was like a whole different machine in the corners. I mean, it was night and day. And for me, it was stiffening it up. So I wanted to get into that mainspring a little bit sooner, because I personally liked a little more of a harsh ride myself. I like to be able to push it and know that I could push it if I needed to. I didn't like bottoming out. I wanted to be able to push the machine if I could. So the crossover to me was something that I learned much later in racing, and it is very important. It really is. But it's something you just have to play with and kind of get the feel for what you want. Because if you end up taking away too much of that tender spring, the small spring, and getting into your mainspring sooner, it's pretty simple. You're going to have a harsher ride, but it's going to corner really well, because you're not going to have that body roll. You're not going to well, to an extent, you can go too far, of course, but then if you don't have enough and you're in the tender spring too long, you're going to have a very plush ride over small bumps, but it's going to have tons of body roll in the corner. So it's a fine line, and it's one that I really got onto later in my career, and it helped a lot with corner speed. It really did, but it's tricky. It takes a lot of playing with to really learn what you like as a rider.
That's very interesting. That's I know I learned a lot already tonight. So let's take a break and maybe see about some of these questions real quick. It's cool to have them, but I knew this would be important with guys wanting to learn something. So here we go.
So this question is, do you want to read it here? Is there a recommended or superior caster setting?
That's a loaded question, because it really depends on how crazy you want it to feel or how stable you want it to feel. I don't know. Do you have a recommendation, Bart? I played with caster a lot. Personally, I kind of liked a little bit more of a free ride, so I liked it to be a little bit sketchy at points myself. But I don't really have a set number for that, a set percent.
Generally, when I set up everything, I'm generally a degree negative. Give a little bit of caster. Caster is the ball joint tipped backwards or forwards. Camber would be it tipped in or out. So that would be the angle of the tire. You see a lot of people, their tires kind of V-shaped. Yeah. That's the camber side of it. Caster is the angle backwards. And the idea of caster is to center the wheel on its own. Because if the ball joint is tipped back at the top, as the tire rotates, it wants to come back to a center position because the ball joint is leaned back. So if you want a very stable ride, you want more negative caster. Negative because forward is positive, reversed is negative.
Okay.
The closer to zero, the better it would be in tight woods. It would be more nimble, but in the straightaways, it'll want to dart and move around a lot. So caster would help take that away, the wandering. It'd give you more of a stable feel, but it won't turn as quick or as sharp.
Yep.
Now is that something you're changing with just the Heims then?
Generally, like Hauser, they've got the pins in the washer. You can just loosen them up and rotate them. Yep. If that A arm is adjustable with Heims, then yes, you would have to adjust the Heim. The deal is with the Heims, if you get too crazy there, you're changing camber also, because that is moving the A arm out or in, one of the two. So that will change camber slightly also. Anytime you make an adjustment on the front end of one, you would always want to recheck your toe when you're done, because you're changing the angle of that A arm. It is going to either shorten or lengthen the tie rod, so it will throw that out of whack also.
Yes.
Go ahead, Matt. Sorry.
I typically ran neutral caster. Like I said, I liked to be nimble. I guess I should correct myself. I typically ran neutral caster in the OMA in the Iowa series, because there was typically less straightaways and high speeds. When I started running GNCC consistently, I would rock it back a degree or two, and I would even change it depending on the track, because there was a couple GNCC tracks that are just a lot of straightaways, and that stability really helps. But if you go too far, you'll wear yourself out. It in the tight woods. It can be a bear to kind of turn in the tight woods if you get too far. And like Bart said, no matter what, you always check toe last, because everything you're going to do with camber and caster is going to mess with the toe. And I don't know on other machines what the front end geometry is like, but I ran neutral toe with no rider on the machine on a Honda. And that's what all of me and my friends ran on the Honda, because you actually toe in as you go through the travel pretty significantly. So if you don't, you'll end up with a lot of pushing in the corners.
So is this something that Avery that asked that question is one of our top riders in the series? is that something that you would discourage like newer riders from touching and do more, experienced riders? If there's going to mess with that, it's probably more of an experienced rider.
Probably. Well, yeah, you would want to have a little bit of suspension knowledge and understanding and knowing you have your shock set up properly before I would mess too much with caster. Yeah, it's definitely.
Gotcha. Chris, you got anything?
Yep. So we have another question. Can we discuss a little bit long travel versus standard travel?
Yeah, standard travel. I mean, to an extent, they both are kind of equal if they're set up correctly. The difference is what the word says: travel. It's the extension and the compression of that rear swing arm, and of course the A arms. Long travel keeps the tire in the contact patch better, probably. Where standard travel, you'd have a tendency to bottom out, or if they're extending a lot, like in a real rough section, you'll actually feel the shock bottom more or less, or run out of travel. And a lot of times you can actually feel that in the bars, which, if it's rough enough, you might get out of control with that aspect. But long travel, you have a tendency to not get that kind of feedback because there is more movement of the tire.
Yep.
Now with the long travel, can you? That's one thing I wanted to ask you a little bit later was about. You hear a lot of people talking about ride height and changing, and I've heard the question asked several times on the line. People talking, just listening and saying, "What does ride height have to do with cross country?" You know what I mean? They're just looking at the height of their machine is what they're looking at. But I think going back to the long travel versus short, doesn't that also help your long travel kind of helps adjust your ride height too then, or not?
We always try to get to a specific number for cross country. Generally, like on the Hondas, it's 7 and 7.25 inches, 7 to the rear, 7.25 to the front. Yamaha, a little different. We used to set them up a little different because the tubes on the bottom of the Yamaha usually are straight instead of angling up. So you had a tendency to stick the nose of the quad in the ground more. So we would put the front at 7.5, 7.75, just to kind of counter that problem, or to get away from, nose diving. I'm sure everybody's hit the other end of a dip or a whoop enough where dirt blew up in your face, so that's what you're trying to get away from is the scooping of the front end in the ground. Ride height, what that does is it somewhat centers the suspension. So if you've got 3 inches of travel, just for a number's sake, and you've got your ride height set to where you're in the center of your travel, you get the equal amount of movement upward and you get the equal amount of movement downward. If you get your ride height too high, you tend to bicycle really bad. And what I mean by bicycle is it comes up on 2 wheels. It wants to canter over or roll on you. Ideally, what we're shooting for, and like what Matt was explaining about crossover, where it really plays a big part in the cornering, is when you come into the corner and the suspension sags or drops, you want your A-arms parallel. If the A-arms are down, you have a tendency to bottom or push out of the corner. The tire doesn't want to stay in contact. If your suspension is angled down, you're not getting enough drop or sag. It has a tendency to 2-wheel or come up on the 2 outer wheels. And of course, you either have to come out of the corner straight or somewhere you're going to tip over, one of the two. So the ride height generally will get you in that sweet spot in your cornering where your A-arms are parallel. And if you've got it set right and that doesn't have an excessive amount of roll, you can rail that corner like nobody's business. It's a really neat feeling to go in there almost wide open, turn the bar slightly, and it just railroads right around that corner with little effort. So the idea of the ride height is to get the geometry of that front end parallel cornering mainly, and to split the suspension where you get an equal amount up and equal amount of down travel.
The ride height, that is a big deal for cross country then.
Absolutely. Correct? It is crucial.
Yeah. Very. I would say the biggest benefit to the long travel is you typically, so with standard travel, stock suspension, you of course, it's standard. You don't have quite the travel. So when you set your ride height, you're sacrificing a little bit of that downward wheel travel. So that the biggest improvement on going aftermarket suspension, in my personal opinion, and maybe Bart would have a better answer to this, is the heat soak. So the stock shocks don't do well with the heat if you're really pushing them. So I'm speaking to the riders that are AA riders. If you're below that, you're gonna probably, unless you're way out in front of your whole class, you're probably not pushing them hard enough to really heat soak those shocks bad, even on stock ones. But that's one thing I noticed. But when I would ride the stock revalves, and then the other is you get a fair amount more down travel with a long travel setup, but it's not significant for the beginning rider. That's why I highly recommend for the price point, the revalves are just the way to go. The other thing that I thought of earlier that I forgot to mention was, and is the how to explain this the best. It's really easy. I mean, I guess I'll just put it bluntly. It's really easy to screw up expensive shocks. It's pretty hard to screw up revalves if you have them set up by a professional like Bart, or really any big shock manufacturer that does revalves. Derisi, BNR, Bart, any of these guys that do revalves, even if you just bolted them on and you didn't touch them, the way they send them to you after they get done with them, it's gonna blow your mind if you're riding stock. If you just buy a set of stage 5s from Elka, they're not gonna come set up with all the clicks in a certain spot or whatever. You're going to have to tweak that, and it's really easy to mess those up and get them so far out of whack that you think they're junk, even though you just spent $3,000 on suspension or $4,000. You're going to be disappointed in it. So that's another reason why I really recommend revalves for people unless you really know your suspension stuff, because they're tweaking on a good long travel setup can get a little overwhelming for a new rider, for sure.
Gotcha. Okay, more questions there, Chris?
Yep. So Avery came back with another one here. Can you kind of go into and talk a little bit more about air shocks? So lower pressure sets ride height, and depending if the quad is diving or two-wheeling, you can go up or down in pressure on the bottom end. What do I want out of the upper air pressure, or how should I want it to handle?
I'll take this one. Sell them. Buy spring shocks. Anything more than that, Bart can handle. I rode them all. Not a fan of air shocks. Not a fan.
With a set of Fox floats, you buy the suspension to match your A-arms and your linkage. So once you get the linkage and A-arm in mind, generally then you shop for your shock length and your stroke. So all the manufacturers have a recommended length of shock, fully extended and then completely compressed. So with an air shock, let's take a Hauser front end. They recommend a 19-inch shock. We generally would put them at 18 3/4, like the majority of the long travel companies that make stuff for Honda. They seem to actually work a little better at that length. The problem is with an air shock is your main chamber, the low pressure side, is what's used to set ride height. So you don't have much choice of the air pressure because it is the ride height. So let's say 42 pounds puts you at 7 1/4 inches. You're pretty much stuck to 42 pounds of air to keep that ride height correct. The high pressure chamber is basically the mainspring of a sprung shock. So as the air pressure builds in the lower chamber and it starts to spike, eventually it will equalize the pressure in the high pressure chamber, and there's a piston in there that'll start rising. Well, that chamber is very small, so it doesn't take long for that to spike, which creates the resistance that a mainspring would do once you've crossed over. So air pressure in the main is ride height, period. It's about all you can do. The only way you can get around that, I would make adjustments. When I did Fox floats for people, I would put spacers in the shock to bring the inner spring or the negative spring in sooner, where you could put more air pressure. Make the shock shorter where you could add more air pressure. There's some tricks that your shock tuner can do to help you, but out of the box, the low side or the low pressure chambers ride height, there's not much movement there. The high pressure side, like I said, that's your feedback like a mainspring. That just takes some ride time to play with those to try to get, there's recommendations that Fox will put out there for you to give you a start, but you just got to play around with them a little bit till you find what's the most comfortable to you. Unfortunately, air shocks, they're adjustable, but they're not. The air side, low pressure is ride height. High pressure will give you your mainspring feel, but there are a lot of hydraulic adjustments to that to help aid that a little bit also. Hope that helped. I hope I didn't confuse anybody there, but like I said, the low pressure side is just ride height, so there's not a lot of choice.
Wow, very good, very good.
Good info.
Yeah. So I got another one here pop up. How about stiffening shocks up at the track to transfer weight and plant, let's say, like a left rear, for example? Is it easy to do on a set of revolves?
And I think that question coming, Bart, is I think Dave runs more like circle track and TT, than cross country, the one that asked that question.
Okay. Well, your hydraulic adjustments will speed up or slow down the fluid moving through the ports in the shock. So you can make adjustments in that aspect, but the only way to really change a spring or a shock to feel different is a spring change, more or less. If you're going to be doing big jumps, stuff like that, you want to go up on spring rates. Of course, you're going to bottom out if you don't. If you don't change spring rate with hydraulic adjustment, eventually you'll overheat the shock so bad that it will totally fade out. Keep that in mind. So the harder you push a shock, if you're having to use all the hydraulics it has to slow it down, it is going to overheat in time. You're pushing oil through an orifice. So the smaller that orifice, the more friction, the more heat. So you got to keep that in mind. You can overdo it and actually, make it worse in the long run. So you got to be kind of cautious there. But spring rate change is really the only way, because keep in mind, you want to keep ride height. If you start adding turns into the preload, you're going to raise ride heights at the same time as stiffening the spring. I'll do a little bit of maybe a helpful visual for people. A spring is rated by 1 inch of compressed travel. So when we put that in a spring tester, we zero the gauge when we make zero contact, just snug on the spring, and we compress it 1 inch. That is the rate of that spring. So I could really go down a rabbit hole here. I could give you some very helpful information, but it would take a while to really get it across. But the more preload you put into that spring, say we generally go 3 turns, 5 maximum. And if it's at 0, of course, the spring can be loose at times. So the more preload you put in that spring to counter that, the progression rate starts climbing quicker and quicker. Because remember, when you compress that spring 1 inch, say it's a 375-pound spring, if you compressed it 1 inch, that spring is starting at 375 pounds before you set the quad on the ground or you set on it. So you can imagine another inch and a half of compressed shaft length from sag. Just imagine where that spring rate is starting, and it will progress straight up. That's where you get you jam your back really bad. Like if you hit a real hard whoop and bottomed, you'll start getting feedback, because the progression rate of that spring will go so fast that it'll take all the rideability out of it. It'll just be like a pogo stick.
Very informative.
Yeah, I'll go ahead. I want you to ask some questions. Go ahead.
I know, because we got a comment that it's very nice to hear somebody other than you talk all the time.
Yeah. Okay. Here we go.
So what if, it's kind of like, as we've been talking about budget and starting out here, what if I'm new? I'm just, maybe interested in doing some shock work, but I can't afford to have all my shocks done. So would you have a preference, front or rear first? Maybe to have revolved.
Gosh, save up until you can do them all. It's really tough to do one or the other.
Okay.
Because both of them in their stock fashion, it is just so aggressive. So you're going to take stiffness in both front and rear, and you're going to make one of them really soft and really pliable or plush, and the other one is just going to completely blow that setting out of the water. It'll just override it. It'll be so uncomfortable. Your front end will either be jouncey and beat you up, and the rear's bottoming out, or the rear's going to want to throw you over the handlebars, and the front's going to feel pretty decent. So you're really going to shoot yourself in the foot, in my opinion. I don't know that I would want to ride one with just half of it done.
Okay.
I don't know if you could even set your ride height up with one, because you say you just want to do the rear and leave the fronts factory. You'll do a link and your revalve and respring your rear shock, and you'll get your ride height correct in the rear. But I know for a fact stock Honda front springs will not allow you to get to the ride height in the front that you're going to want to be at. So it'll be and like I said, that like Bart said many a times, I mean, it's something so simple, and I know I did as a very young amateur. You want to mess with that preload on that spring, but you actually don't. Ride height is ride height, and you do not want to change that. I have tweaked with it because I didn't believe people like Bart telling me stuff, and I would mess with it and try lower ride height or higher ride height, and you can really get things out of whack by doing that. So the recommended ride height that we're speaking of on the Honda, and that Bart said, and Honda's the only thing I can speak on, but that is where you want to be 100%. And so if you just do one, it's just not, they're not going to line up. They're not going to gel. Like Bart said, it honestly might be worse than a factory setup, to be honest. It could very well be worse.
All right.
Yeah, the leverage ratio on an aftermarket link is so much more leverage to that rear spring. So you've got to go up on rate to create that, the resistance, but you want that plush ride too. On the front, and this used to always kind of blow my mind until I understood it, is how do you take a front shock stock with a 165-pound mainspring and then put a 180-pound main and a 250-pound tender, and it rides completely different and plush. I just couldn't understand why you would take two big spring rates and it ride better than a single softer spring rate. And that's where that progression comes in. So that spring's 165 on the front. You put the quad on the ground, you compressed it 1.25 inches, and then you climb on the bike, you compress it another, let's say, inch and a half. Well, you just compress that spring 3 inches. Where's that rate at? That rate is probably 275, 300 pounds or more. So you're starting at a spring that's 300 pounds of pressure just sitting there. That's where you get that jouncey, terrible, terrible ride. Well, when you put two springs on, you compress the top spring, say 1/8 to 3/16 of an inch, and the main spring gets compressed 1/4. You're not even close to the rate of that spring because you divided the travel between two of them. So your beginning points are so light. There's where you get your plush feel. That's how you can make that ride so much better with a dual rate setup. Even triple rate, it'll even get even plusher yet because you're dividing that compressed length between 3 springs. So in order to compress them all to their rate, you'd have to move 3 inches immediately, and all 3 springs would have to compress 1 inch. So, excuse me, that's how you get the plush feel and the plush ride, is dividing the travel between different springs, multiple springs.
Very good information. So Bart,
that's where the crossover comes into play, the timing of when you take the 2 compressed and then you get into that main. That's where the crossover comes into play.
So, Bart, you kind of mentioned that you used to do all of this work and used to do, can you kind of talk about what you do now? Are you still kind of helping, and anybody that calls, you'll help them out as much as possible? But
Sure. I get several people to call.
Yep.
Yeah, I get a lot of people.
What would you do if somebody actually wanted some work done? Would you refer them to somebody else?
I sold the business to an individual. He's not around right at the moment. He's had some other things to take care of. So I've done a few sets here and there for just people that I used to do them for. Nothing anywhere near the scale of what I was doing. I had no time is the reason why I got out of it. I run an auto and diesel repair facility, and I was coming in at 6 a.m, working till 8 or 9 at night after my 8 to 5 shift and before. And then I was working all weekend, and I just had no time. That's the reason why I got out of it. But I had people send me text messages at 3 a.m. wanting to know if their shocks were done yet. So it just kind of got to be a nuisance in a sense, but I do miss it. It was fun, but I'm
just asking because we've had some comments. Guys have, of course, made comments about how the great work that you've done for them. There was a comment out here that somebody's maybe looking at getting some revalving done. So, Matt, do you use anybody else currently, or refer maybe our racers to somebody?
Well,
I'm gonna go grab a drink of water real quick. I'll be right back.
Yeah. I would 100% refer to Bart if he was still doing it. I have the utmost respect for everything that he does and has did for me. I mean, I learned. That's where like I said earlier, I learned it all. But if he's not doing anything for guys, I worked with Ryan at B&R pretty extensively towards the end of my career there, and he's busier. I know that. I don't know what his status is. That I actually haven't talked to him in about 2 years, but I had great luck with him. He is also a wizard with shocks, just like Bart is. He knows his stuff. So I would recommend him for sure. I had great luck with him. Like I said, for sure him. I know, but there's a lot of them out there. I mean, I've talked to the Derisi guys at GNCCs a lot. They do good work. I know a lot of people happy with them. I mean, my recommendation would be to anybody if you're getting a set of shocks, no matter if it's a revalves or you're getting stage 5 Elkas, you're getting floats, you're getting Axis, anything like that, deal either direct. I wouldn't even say deal directly with the company, to be honest. I did ride with Custom Access directly for a while. Not that it wasn't a great experience. I had a great experience with them, had a good relationship with Micah at Access. It was great, but I still felt like I got a little better help and understanding dealing with Bart and dealing with Ryan at B&R. I still felt better dealing with them personally. So I would just recommend, no matter what you're doing, shock-wise, revalves, Elkas, Fox, I don't care what brand you're buying or doing, what level, get them from a reputable dealer, a reputable source, because they're going to help you set those shocks up properly. And that was kind of what I was trying to stress earlier. You can mess a shock. You can buy the best shock on planet. If you gave me the best set of Custom Access they have, but I was brand new when I started racing back in 2007 or whenever it was, and knew absolutely nothing about shocks, I would have them so jacked up that I wouldn't be able to ride them. It'd be as bad as riding a stock suspension machine. So deal with somebody that that's going to be able to help you when you have questions, and or just at least send them out to you in the ballpark. Like I said, guys like Bart and Ryan, they send them out. They're at least in the ballpark. Yeah, they're not perfect. You still need to tweak with them, write things down constantly so you can go back to those previous settings if you mess it up. But at least you're in the ballpark. You're close on some settings. That would be my recommendation. Is just go with a reputable dealer of some sort that has good customer service and will help you out and there's a lot of YouTube videos and different things online too. And like I said, I have no problem answering some questions because there's a few settings that are just they're set in stone. Like ride height is set in stone. I mean, anybody that tells you different probably doesn't know. I mean, on a Honda, we're all riding the same ride height. Tucker, me, Adam, Jared McClure, it doesn't matter. We're all riding the same ride height because it's just one thing that you can't mess with. So go with a reputable dealer would be my recommendation, no matter what level of shocks you're buying.
Did you actually state what that ride height was for Hondas?
7.25.
Yep. So you measure the front on the Honda is 7.25, and it's get on perfectly level ground, rider on the machine in full gear, and you measure from the concrete surface to the back of the rear A-arm bolt, and then not the actual bolt, the frame, the bottom of the frame, but that's where you're going to measure, right behind the rear A-arm bolt, and then you're measuring right at the bottom of the frame, right below the foot pegs for the rear measurement, and that's 7. So 7 and 7.25, and I would not tweak with that much. I mean, if you mess with it too much, you do notice a difference drastically, for sure.
And for a Yamaha, it was 7.5.
We do 7 and 7.75, just because the frame tubes don't have the angle that the Honda does, and you tend to stick the nose in the ground a little bit. So a little more ride height on the Yamaha.
Yep.
Something else you want to do, and it's very simple and it's easy to overthink or underthink it, not do it. Make sure your air pressure in your tires are where you're going to ride it before you do. If you got one at 7 pounds and one at 10, that's going to throw everything off.
Or okay,
so just make sure your tire pressures are right before you start.
Andy and I are very familiar with tire pressure, right, Andy? Flat.
Yeah, we are. Why don't you tell Bart about that, Chris? I'd like to hear your version. Okay.
Flat is good. All right.
Maybe if it's sitting in the garage.
I don't want to tell you, but Chris was my tire guy at my first GNCC race at the Ironman one time. And I go pulling up to the fastest 4x4 lineup. And Chris was riding up there with me. And only after I asked him, he was my pit guy. He was having fun. We were all having fun with it. And he goes, tires are good. Let's go. And we jumped on the four-wheeler. He rode up the line with me as we're pulling up there. Oh, I can't say his name now, but factory Kawasaki guy looks down and he goes, Andy, he goes, you got a flat tire, don't you? Oh, really? I had I don't even know what it was, but I think it was muddy enough. I didn't even realize it, but so we had to turn around and go back and get air in it again. I fired my tire guy right there and there. So
it's one way to get out of pit crewing.
So, I forgot what I was going to ask you. Let's go on to another question. Then I'll remember it, I guess.
I think that was pretty much, we wrapped up all the questions. There's just some comments about it, like we indicated that people love the work that Bart's done over the years for them. I actually got a good one. I'll just throw this one up here. Very informative. Nice to hear somebody besides Andy. So I'm just making sure this one gets in the podcast.
Oh boy.
I know
so
we haven't said anything on camber much. I don't know what your recommendations are, Bart. I know we didn't ever talk too much about camber caster when I was riding on your suspension. I typically, for guys, I would recommend very little for cross country racing. I didn't personally like a whole lot of camber. I think I ran right about a degree of camber, 1.5 degrees is what I ran. What's your recommendation, Bart?
Generally, the way I would do it is I took a framing square, and when I had the quad sitting on the ground with the rider on it, I'd set the framing square on the ground and then bring it up the tire. And I generally do about 1/2 inch. I don't know what that comes out to in a degree.
That's about a degree is my experience.
The straight edge and the sidewall of the tire. The idea of that is when you go into the corner, the tire is angled out and the contact patch will actually roll. The sidewall will, which will bring the rubber square as the sidewall gives. It's just to help that from rolling under. And then all you have is the knobbies on the outer edge that are actually gripping. So it just kind of helps keep the tire patch more square in the corner.
Yep.
Well, it sounds to me like we need some young blood to feed off of Bart and start up a suspension place locally. That was the thing with you, Bart. I know everybody that maybe not have made it to you had, regret it now, because having somebody right here close, to within our range, most of our people are, Iowa to Missouri, somewhere around in there and stuff. And you're just very accessible to get to and answer questions. What would you suggest to somebody that may want to start getting into it and learning the suspension to maybe start working on suspension?
Oh, I mean, it's not as difficult as what a lot of people might think. The hardest part for me was learning how much to actually change for people, not getting too drastic or not enough. Riders tend to get a little irritated if they have to take them back off and send them back in a week or two for another adjustment because you didn't go far enough. It's crucial to have that feedback. You've got to understand. The rider needs to be able to tell the tuner what's going on so you can make the best adjustment possible. But for somebody just getting into the business, it's a hydraulic cylinder with valving and a piston, so you're just going to speed up and slow down the traveling of that fluid through that valving stack or bleed holes or adjustment holes through the rebound and compression side. So it's not real hard. To rebuild the shock is actually simple. It's just seals and oil. The trick's keeping the air out. And of course, the more you do that, the easier it gets. But yeah, heck, if you've got the want, bottle of nitrogen, a few tools, access to seal kits and some oil, and you can get yourself started up pretty good.
I know Matt's not busy these days. Maybe that's something we can talk him into doing just a little bit more.
Yeah, I'm not busy at all.
So we had another question pop up.
Real quick, do you guys remember there was an old dinosaur that used to race with us for a long time? I think he's kind of perched on top of tractors now more than anything. But do you remember a guy by the name of he ran for most popular? Remember, he put up all the signs. What was his name?
Jason Goody.
Oh, Goody. Yeah, Jason Goody. I just happened to see he was watching. Man, talk about a dinosaur coming out to play with the guys again. That's pretty cool.
Whoa.
So go ahead with your question.
All right. So a question came in. So should we set caster first, toe, and then camber?
I always set toe last. That was the last thing I did.
Yep.
So caster, camber, toe.
Yep.
Okay.
You're not running enough degrees of that. You're usually at 0 to 1, maybe 2. So I always set the caster and camber first and then do the toe. Just because the other two adjustments will affect that toe in. So I always make it last.
Check your toe before every race. You'd be amazed at how easy it is to knock the toe out, or you didn't tighten down a jam nut or whatever may be different. I check my toe before every race, and it's pretty important for sure. And it's always the last thing you want to check after doing any adjustments, anything you do. Doesn't matter if I ever messed with any hub, any bearings, anything. If I did anything, steering stem, it didn't matter. I always checked it again. It's a finicky one for sure, and it can make a big difference. And a 16th and an 1/8 inch can make that thing feel a lot different. So I always checked it last and checked it often.
I think Mr. Cooksey is thinking about working on suspension. He's getting this all dialed, taking some notes here. So, Bart, if we had a guy that wanted to come back and race, let's say maybe he had known as Mr. Heartland, like somebody that won the Heartland 3 times in a row, even like on an Ironman class, and wanted to make the announcement that he was going to race the Heartland this year. Is that something that you would adjust his suspension on and make sure it would make it 10 hours?
Absolutely. Be fun to get involved again. I don't, of course, wouldn't want to get to the level I was, but it'd still be fun to play around with it once in a while.
Very cool.
Man.
They might need you there at the race, though, just to make sure everything goes right.
That's not apple juice. I'm not in shape enough. I got 70,000 chickens that rely on me now. I don't know about that, Andy. I'm just a fat old farmer now.
I wouldn't say that.
So
I would. Yeah, I think you still got it.
So the very good
I know
question.
you that medal over anything else, and mine.
That's one thing I will say. I will put my body in jeopardy over my will not give up. My body might, but my will won't. And that's probably why I did so good at those. I wasn't necessarily in good enough shape to compete for that long at that level, but my mind sure pushed through for a while.
So thanks, those are still sticking through. We're about an hour and a half in. Very good questions tonight. So here, another one as well. What adjustments could maybe we be doing on our stock A arms?
It's kind of limited on stock. There's no adjustment really there. There are some places that we're actually cutting the top ball joint out and putting an adjustable ball joint that's threaded in them. So you could make some adjustment, at least a camber, but you're pretty limited on stock. They're just welded up tubing with bearings in them and a ball joint. So there's not much there, just a toe in adjustment. And of course your ride height with your suspension.
Yep.
But that's pretty simple. It takes a lot of the guessing out of it, and you get kind of used to it. Then you can move up to something that has more adjustment.
And I don't know if you've ever checked it, Bart. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's the stock at least on a Honda, I believe the stock camber caster is neutral. I know the camber is, but caster, I can't say I've ever actually checked caster. I just know it's definitely a little bit darty at speed on stock A arms. But with that being said, I still wouldn't trade the stock suspension on stock arms for anything else. I would do the A arms second, unless your A arms are shot. If your bushings and ball joints are shot, then look into there's some cheap alternatives, but look into even just a non-long travel arm. They are considerably cheaper than a long travel setup, and they do give you the adjustment then.
Exactly
right. Cool. I'll tell you what, guys, we've had a lot more comments, a lot more questions on this one than we have before, which just backs up the theory that how important the suspension is and how many people are wanting to learn it, with the questions and everything. So I'd like to hear kind of a closing statements from you two on a couple things. I'm gonna let you kind of do your open, but I want to ask a question I forgot about earlier. At what age do you, and I'll ask you why I did this, because I was probably a bad dad. I made my kids race on narrow machines for a long time. I'd never let them widen a machine out for nothing, clear up until the time they got, actually, I don't even think we widened any machine. I think they were stock on the 300. They were stock on the 450. But tell me, your opinion on a youth riding on a narrow machine. Do you start them out on a wide machine that's the most stable? And at what point do you suggest looking at suspension? Is it by experience wise? Is it by how quick they are? Or at what point do we, instead of just saying, I just want to buy suspension for it, where do you start recommending looking at the suspension on that?
Well, my son started riding when he was, in the kids class, and I put Elkas on his, and it wasn't because I wanted him to be flashy. I wanted him to be safe. And some of those youth quads are just ridiculous on suspension. I mean, you can't even consider some of it suspension. I've seen better springs on screen doors, so that's why I did on my sons. I put Elkas on his. They didn't have a lot of travel, but we were able to make it ride a lot better for them and keep them under control better. As for width, heck, I rode stock width quads forever when I first started. And then when I got, when I met Michael Burrows and Josh Eaton, of course, those guys were running pro. So, and I actually contribute a lot of my knowledge of getting into this to Michael, Josh, and Dwayne Johnson. You take three pros and, they kind of took me under their wing and just fed me full of all this information. That's when I started, making it a little bit wider for more stability, where you could corner a little bit better. I tend to hit a little more stuff when I got wider, but at the same time, you got to give to get, I guess. So I don't really have a time frame I would do on widening a quad, but suspension wise, I mean, I started as soon as I could with my son.
Gotcha.
I'd agree with that completely. I don't think it's ever too early. I think, like Bart said, safety, comfort, saving your body, all the above. It's easier on the machine too. I mean, it's just, I think you can also develop some maybe not quite so good riding habits with stock shocks versus aftermarket ones, because there is such a vast difference. I don't feel that way about horsepower. I actually, in my personal opinion, in cross country racing, unless you were racing at the XC1 level, maybe even a little XC2, but XC1 level, you don't need it. I don't care what anybody says. That's my opinion, and you'll never change my mind. I've raced it. You don't need it. You can run a completely stock Honda motor, and you can compete if you're good enough and you have your suspension set up right. I mean, to me, people that waste the money on motor is just, it doesn't make sense in my mind. I mean, I did it for a long time, and even my fully built motors for when I was racing XC2 were not fully built. I mean, they were cam port job, and my last 2 years I did run a little bit higher compression, but I was not running what the XC1 guys were running on compression or anything like that. I mean, it's just absolutely not necessary. I mean, I think the suspension is, though. I really do. And I think at any age, it's never too early to start learning about it. For starters, being a little bit safer, more comfortable, better technique if you have the proper handling quad. I think it's important. So as soon as you're financially ready to make the commitment, I think do it. And like I said, you start out small. If you don't have the big dollars, just do the revalve. There's absolutely nothing wrong with revalves. If people haven't already noticed, I'm a huge fan of revalves. I mean, I never, through my whole racing career, I never didn't have a quad that had revalves on it. I always had at least one machine that had revalves, and I rode it all the dang time. I loved it.
Very nice. Well, I know, Matt, I know you ride red as a racer, right? So I'm gonna ask you this: what color of tractor does a true farmer ride?
Well, I don't personally worry too much about what color it is. For me, on our operation, it's all about the value. So what can I get with my what can I get that's gonna cost me the least in the long run, but give me the technology and the horsepower that I need? I mean, with that being said, I have an IH tattoo on my leg, but almost all of our equipment is actually Kloss or Challenger. So we run pretty much all German engineered stuff on the farm, but that's strictly from an economic standpoint. They're considerably cheaper than any other color, and man, they're monsters. They will eat grain. They'll work. I mean, we don't run new equipment. We don't have anything. I think our newest piece of equipment would be 2016, I believe, maybe. I can't remember off the top of my head. We don't run very new equipment. A lot of our stuff's actually quite a bit older. So the longevity is very important to us, and the service and availability on parts, and just it all comes down to the economics. I mean, you gotta make money, so can't be going out and buying $750,000 combine every 2 years. Just doesn't work out for our operation.
Yeah, I was just curious because I seen Goody was still watching, so I was hoping you would say green or something. Just anything. anything but red, but you kind of shot me in the foot there when you said you already have a tattoo says IH. So
Yeah, I agree with Goody on that one a little bit. I like IH myself. I like red, but we don't have a whole lot of red equipment on the farm anymore. We have a few pieces of equipment, but not much.
yeah, I was just giving him a hard time. Stuck my foot in my mouth there, though.
I'm honest. Honestly, I mean, people give me a lot of shit all the time, but I'm not partial to anything. I really don't care what color it is, as long as it makes me money and it's reasonable on price. I mean, that's the only reason we don't run deer. You just can't afford to buy the dang things. I have no problem with them. I run them plenty for other farmers that I help out and different things, and I love them. But I'm not a rich farmer. I can't afford them.
Okay, with having said that, I'm gonna give you crap. What do you drive for a vehicle?
I have a Volkswagen diesel car and I have a Chevy Duramax.
Okay. So in your opinion, though, driving a Prius would actually be pretty smart, though, right?
Oh yeah, why not? Toyota makes good stuff. I just wouldn't probably buy a Prius, but we've got it all. We've got a couple Cummins on the farm too. I mean, yeah, we're not partial to anything. It's what works, in my opinion.
Right. Well, man, I know you're both busy, and I appreciate you guys coming back this week with both of you had what did you guys have last week? I think it was the same thing.
Flu.
Influenza.
Influenza. Yeah.
I was sicker than could be, and I ended up losing my voice. Well, the morning of it was supposed to be the podcast, I had almost no voice, so I had to. That's when I texted you, Andy, and was like, I don't know that this is going to work out because I can't hardly talk.
Yeah.
My mom couldn't understand my text messages, so she knew I was pretty sick.
Well, we definitely thank you guys for coming on. Like I said, it's you two. I got all the faith in the world in, and would listen to anything that you two have to say, and whether it be suspension or setting a bike up or motor or anything. So we definitely appreciate it. I know you guys got, if we had a 5-hour show, I guarantee we'd have people commenting for 5 hours with you two. So thank you guys very much just for taking the time. And I think we'll probably see you both back on here again in some later episodes. So
actually, Matt's gonna return next week. We're gonna kind of shift a little bit away from the machine itself and kind of focus on the racer. So we'll talk a little bit about fitness and nutrition next week.
Yeah, I'm excited about that one. I got a little perspective since I've quit racing that I think might help a few guys that are still racing. I hope on that one. And this one, I was real excited for this one too. I really respect Bart and his knowledge, and I mean, he 100% got me to where I was when I was racing without question. I mean, he knows that. I've told him that. I really respect what he did for me, and very grateful. It was a huge help, and I learned so much. So really glad that everybody else gets a little bit of that knowledge.
It helps too when you got a good rider that can go out and make your stuff work too. So keep that in mind.
Yeah, we had a good relationship. I know it worked really well. I think we made a lot of improvements and learned a lot together. I think it was really good. So I think this was hopefully a really good podcast for people. I mean, I know if I had this back in 2010, 12, it would have helped a lot. So I hope guys take this and think on it and tweak with stuff. Like I said, just write it down, go out, run a loop. I mean, I used to go out in my woods when I was doing suspension testing and stuff like that. I'd take my screwdriver and my wrench, whatever it was, to make my rebound and compression adjustments, and I would just stick them next to a tree, and I would go a tiny little loop. I mean, I wanted it to be less than a mile. I wanted to be a quick lap, so I could make changes and know right away, and something that had a lot of curves and a lot of bumps or whatever. And I was messing with, and the notebook, and just write down where you're at, so you can always go back to that. And that helped me out a ton. And helped me give feedback to whoever your shot guy is. In my case, it was Bart for most of my career, and it was helped me give feedback that this is what I'm struggling with, so I think we need to try this or that. Or he would tell me, okay, we need to try this. I mean, it's really what you got to do. I mean, there's a reason there's an engineer in every one of the NASCAR pits, because the suspension is important. So just think of that before you go racing, is is mess with it and try and learn yourself. We don't all have access to the engineer, but you can still make some changes on your own and try some things.
And I think you just kind of hit on one thing that we haven't really discussed. I know Bart discussed a little bit on his suspension, on how he remembered stuff, but taking notes that you've made changes and stuff like that, that's probably not a bad idea to have that little notebook, you know, with your race stuff or, you know, your gear or whatever, and keep track of the notes, and whether it be each track or whether it be just like you just said, making the changements. I went 6 this way or 6 that way, you know, so you're not forgetting. Yep. But there's just so much technical stuff with that. I know I would have to be writing everything down.
And don't do what I did either. Don't try every set of shocks ever made in 4 years. I mean, looking back on it, it was really pretty dumb. I mean, Bart helped me out with a set of Elkas that were phenomenal. I probably should have stuck with them longer than I thought. You know, I really want to try Axis, and I went on that route. And I have no problem with any company shocks I rode whatsoever, whether they were helping me or not. It doesn't matter. I had no issue with them. But if you have something that you're at least close on, stick with it. Any one of the companies is going to work very well. I mean, they really do. They all work great. Just little tweaks here and there. That was something I do regret. I think I bounced around way too much. I mean, I should have, to be honest, I should have probably stuck with that first set of Elkas that Bart helped me out with. And they were phenomenal shocks. And it was my first, I would say, really legit setup shocks, and that was because they came from Bart. He had tweaked on them himself. He had rode them personally himself, so he knew them and could help me out with them. If you have something that you think's close, don't go making a big change. I mean, just keep tweaking on them, and you'll get there. I do regret the switching as much as I did on the suspension. It's too complicated to switch every year, I think.
You're kind of reminding me about what we talked about, maybe it was the first episode, about me trying to buy a different hunting gun every year. Get used to the ones you got. You know, it's hard to find one if you don't stick with it. So, but very cool. Well, Bart, in closing, do you want to say anything to the riders? You got a ton of racing experience and stuff with everything. You want to, like, a little closing thing here with new riders or people moving up, you know, in class, and what you would suggest, or starting out, or anything?
Well, you know, we've gone over it several times tonight. Just, you know, the suspension really is probably the key to start. Start small, work your way up, unless you can just find a good set of long travel setup that's, you know, affordable. Like Matt said, once you can afford it, you know, go ahead and get it and stick with it. Something that was really tough for me, a little piece of advice, maybe, if you find a good tuner, a good shock tuner, try not to jump around a lot. We put together a database of what you're on. So it's a lot easier if you stick with that guy. He knows what you're setting on. So if you call and you say, hey, I've got a problem, I've run completely out of rebound, I need more rebound, he can pull a build sheet out of what he did to your stuff last time and make that adjustment. Where if I had a set sent to me from somebody that DeRisi did, I've got to start from scratch. So you may not get as good of an adjustment. When you get the shocks back, they may feel completely wrong because we didn't know where you were prior. We don't know which way the other tuner went. So we may have went the wrong direction. So, you know, if you find a guy that you're comfortable with, stick with them if you can. You know, try not to jump all over the place. Kind of like Matt said with his suspension, he, you know, went to different types and different brands, but and what he stated too was he kind of wished he hadn't have done that. You know, stick with your tuner. If you find a good guy that you can communicate with and he communicates back with you, you know, that's where you need to be.
Very cool.
I agree with that. And I think that was absolutely no knock on Bart's knowledge. Obviously, we all know he's definitely smart and had great tuning skills, but the accessibility and his care when I was with him, like, he actually cared and put the extra effort in to make sure that it was personalized to you and to what you wanted and to understand as best as possible. That's huge. So like you said, if you find a guy that you have a good relationship with and you're comfortable with like that to me is what set working with Bart at Shockworks at the time apart from most. Now, at the level I was riding at, it was a little easier for me because there was a little bit of a want on some guys' level. They wanted me to ride for them, so I got maybe a little different treatment than somebody else. Where with Bart, if you find a guy like Bart, he didn't care if it was Matt Lindle or if it was a C-class rider that just started riding last year. I can guarantee he was putting the same amount of effort in, and I just might have annoyed him a little more with questions and tweaks and wanting to try little things here and there, but he was still putting the same amount of effort in, and that might not be the same at every shop. So if you find a shop that fits well, like he said, don't switch. You'll regret it in the long run. I mean, I really believe that. I mean, like he said, just stick with them, stick with the shocks and tweak on them a little bit here and there. I think you'll be much, much happier 5 years down the road than you would be if you bounce around like I did a lot with different manufacturers and stuff.
Well, very cool. Well, I think this has been very informative podcast. Just thinking about with you two talking, we got the fastest guy, and I say this all the time, Matt, not just because you're here, but the fastest guy ever from Iowa that I know of. So the fastest rider, and I believe that we also got the best suspension guy that I've ever dealt with. So to have you two here working on that together and kind of schooling us and helping us out is priceless. So I really appreciate it. We are looking for a better technical guy behind the scenes.
I was just gonna say you had three of the best here. Okay, you got the best scoring guy here too.
And we have the best talker.
Oh, here we go. Here we go. All right. No, we really appreciate it, guys. I know we've kept you on longer, but it's like Matt and I was talking when we first started talking about this series. It's hard to keep things at an hour when there's so much to learn from and pick you guys' brain and stuff, and Matt and I was talking about like the one for next week, and I remember you, Matt, saying I could talk for 3 hours on that. That's how important it is, and I think each one of these, and if someone actually sits down and watch this, I'm not saying it's because it's our podcast. I'm saying because of the guests that we have coming on and stuff on each one of these and breaking it down in this 7 or 8 series. Boy, if you don't get something out of this, you're not paying attention. So I really, really appreciate you guys coming on. So thank you guys very much for giving us time away from the family and the chickens and the farming and everything. So we do appreciate it.
No, pleasure. Thanks, guys. I really appreciate Bart coming on. The knowledge was definitely awesome.
All right.
The opportunity to give you my opinion anyway. So
very cool. Well, thank you guys.
Yes.
All right.
All right. We'll talk to you next week, Matt. Short week.
Yep. See you guys next week.
We'll see you.
Thanks. See ya.
Yes. Good podcast, buddy. Anything you want to close with? I gotta throw this.
No, I think we covered a lot of it. I think in closing, if we can figure out a way to better the suspension on these pulling tractors or these Priuses, I think we've got the quads covered, so, we got people like Nathan Strand I see out there, that he can use some help, some of his suspension is just strange. I'm telling you, but yeah, so no, it's good to see a lot of people out there watching and looking and stuff. And, I think it was a really good one tonight. Suspension, I think, is still, we've repeated 100 times tonight about being the most important part of XC racing, as far as going faster and being safer. So I think tonight was a great opportunity to get two of the best on here talking about it.
Yep. So I'm looking forward to next week's podcast as well. Fitness and nutrition. So
it's going to be a good one. That's something that every single person can watch. For sure.
Somebody should be able to take something away.
Exactly. Cool.
All right, buddy. Take care. We'll talk to you next week.
All righty. We'll see you. Thanks.